There are two photographs that, placed side by side, tell a complete story without needing a single subtitle. In the first, Diana stands inside the Burgtheater in Vienna, in April 1986, wrapped in a dress of almost liquid green sequins, with a piece of diamonds and a deep emerald encircling her neck. In the second image, taken many years later, that same jewel, the same 3 feathers, the same diamond ring, the same suspended emerald, no longer hangs from a necklace. It is pinned as a brooch on the lapel of Camilla Parker Bowles. For almost 2 decades, the version that circulated on the internet was simple and forceful. Camilla allegedly took the necklace that the Queen gave to Diana, disassembled it, cut it, and repurposed it into something else, as if she had broken into a vault with scissors and intent. The problem is that this version, repeated so many times that it ended up sounding like a proven fact, is not the whole story. It is not even, in several points, the correct story. Because the jewel that the world dubbed Diana's necklace was never born as a necklace. It was, from the beginning, an assembly of separate pieces coming from 2 different wedding gifts given by 2 different men. And the element that gives its name to the entire legend, the 3 feathers surrounded by diamonds, with the emerald hanging below, existed as a brooch more than a century before Diana decided to hang it around her neck like a pendant. What Diana did with that piece was, at the time, a gesture of quiet audacity. What Camilla did later was even more calculated, slower, and filled with more meaning than it appears at first glance. And the exact stage where she decided to showcase the jewel on Charles's arm, surrounded by cameras, on an anniversary celebrating precisely his title, turned a few grams of diamonds into something considerably heavier than any precious stone. Before continuing, if these kinds of stories, the ones that explore what lies behind the polished image of royalty, interest you, it would be a huge help if you subscribed to the channel and left your like. That is what allows us to keep unearthing the part of Diana's life that rarely reaches conventional headlines. It is likely that you have seen one of those photo comparisons that circulate on social media, or a striking headline about Diana's stolen jewel, but almost nobody has taken the trouble to reconstruct the complete chain of events. Who commissioned this piece to be made in 1863, and for what reason? What did Diana really receive on her wedding day, and from whom? Where did that diamond necklace that appears in the most famous photographs come from? Why did Diana decide to use this combination at 3 such distinct and tension-filled moments in her marriage? How did the piece end up in Camilla's hands decades later? And why was Queen Elizabeth II present, seated among the guests, the day the jewel reappeared in one of the most symbolic acts of modern monarchy? By the end of this video, you will be able to distinguish clearly which part of this story is backed by records and photographs, which part was born from an interpretation that was repeated so many times it became truth by accumulation, and which detail, once you know it, completely changes the way one looks at those 2 photographs placed next to each other. Because Camilla did not need to destroy anything Diana had built to spark a reaction. It was enough for her to return the jewel to its oldest form and choose, with complete precision, the exact moment to show it. To understand where this story really comes from, we have to go back much further than Diana, even much further than Queen Elizabeth II. We have to travel to March 1863, when London was preparing to welcome a young woman of barely 18 years old, arriving from Denmark with the name Alexandra. She was coming to marry Albert Edward, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, the man who in time would become King Edward VII. Upon becoming the heir's wife, Alexandra would automatically inherit a title that at that moment she couldn't even imagine how heavily it would weigh on her entire life, Princess of Wales. That wedding had, like all royal unions of the time, an undeniable political background, but for the British public, it turned into a fairy tale with a happy ending. Crowds gathered in the streets to see her pass. The avenues were filled with flags and garlands, and from different corners of the country, gifts began to arrive intended for the future princess. Among those gifts was one particularly loaded with symbolism, a piece of jewelry commissioned and funded by a group of Welsh women who wanted to pay tribute to the new member of the royal family through the very emblem of her new title. Here is where it is worth pausing, because this is the first major misunderstanding that needs to be dismantled. The piece was never a necklace. It was born from the very first sketch as a brooch built around the traditional emblem of the Prince of Wales. In the centre, 3 ostrich feathers carved in diamonds rise as if caught in mid-motion. Right below, a small crown tops the composition. Surrounding the entire set, 18 brilliant cut diamonds form a perfect oval among small colourful details that give depth to the piece. On a ribbon sculpted in precious metal, the historical motto associated with the title is engraved, Ich diene, a phrase of German origin that simply means I serve. And suspended at the lowest part, like a drop about to fall, is a cabochon emerald, smooth, unfaceted, of a green that seems to darken the closer it gets to the skin of the person wearing it, and which has a fundamental characteristic for everything that comes next: it is completely detachable. Each element of this jewel fulfilled a specific and deliberate function. The feathers represented the title, the crown represented the institution that granted it, the motto represented the duty that the title required, and the emerald, precisely because it was detachable, gave the piece something that very few royal jewels have, the ability to transform depending on the occasion, the dress, or the personality of the woman wearing it. This is key and worth underlining from now on. From the very moment of its creation, this jewel was designed to change. It was not conceived as a relic destined to remain motionless inside a velvet-lined display case. It was thought of as a modular piece, capable of passing from one Princess of Wales to the next, adapting to each of them as if the original design had already anticipated that. One day, different women with different stories would have to find their own way of wearing it. Alexandra of Denmark kept that brooch during the long decades she spent waiting, alongside her husband, for the moment when they would finally inherit the throne. She was Princess of Wales for almost 40 years, longer than any other woman in British history up to that point. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, Alexandra finally became Queen Consort, but the feather jewel remained tied forever to the title she had carried since she was barely 18 years old. After that, the piece began a journey much harder to trace with precision, passing through the hands of different women within the royal family. And here we must be honest about the limitations of available information. Public records on British crown jewels are rarely complete, because the palace almost never explains in detail who opens a vault, who authorizes a loan between relatives, or which piece legally belongs to which specific collection. Discretion, in this domain, is the rule, not the exception. What can be confirmed is that, around 1981, the jewel was in the possession of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, widow of King George VI and grandmother of the then Prince Charles. And here it is worth making a clarification that many narratives confuse in a simplified way. When it is said that the Queen gave this jewel to Diana, it is not referring to Elizabeth II. It refers to her mother, also named Elizabeth, known for decades simply as the Queen Mother. It was she, not her daughter, the reigning monarch, who put the three-feather brooch into Diana's hands as a wedding gift. This distinction, which at first glance might seem like a simple genealogical detail, actually matters tremendously. Because the Queen Mother was not just handing over a handful of set diamonds. She was placing into the hands of a 20-year-old woman a symbol that, almost a century earlier, had belonged to another young woman who had also arrived from abroad to marry the heir to the throne. It was, in a sense, passing the baton of a tradition of foreign women turned overnight into the centre of the British public's gaze. On July 29, 1981, it is estimated that around 750 million people around the globe watched, either live or on television, as Diana Spencer walked down the main aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Her ivory taffeta dress unfolded over the steps like a frozen wave, and the exceedingly long train of the dress seemed endless, dragging metre after metre while the whole world held its breath. Resting on her head was the Spencer tiara, a piece that, unlike so many others she would wear later, did not belong to the British crown but to her own paternal family. Amidst that image meticulously constructed to look straight out of a fairy tale, the private reality was different. Diana was deeply nervous. She was barely 20 years old and, as she would later relate, had spent very little time truly alone with the man to whom she was about to promise the rest of her life. That same morning, a small incident occurred that her makeup artist, Barbara Daly, would recall years later with fondness and a touch of nostalgia. Diana had perfumed herself with Quelque's Fleurs, the fragrance she had chosen especially for the ceremony, and accidentally spilled a few drops on the front of the dress. Daly suggested she hold the fabric gently while walking to disguise the stain from the cameras. If one reviews the photographs from that day, it appears that Diana is simply holding her dress with elegance, like a queen who already knows how to pose. In reality, she was hiding a minuscule mistake in front of hundreds of millions of witnesses. That small scene, almost anecdotal, says a lot about who Diana was from the beginning. When something went wrong, she learned to handle it so that no one else could notice. She did it that morning with a perfume stain. Years later, she would have to learn to do the exact same thing, but with wounds far deeper than a simple stain on fabric. Wedding gifts filled entire rooms of the palace. There was fine china, works of art, handcrafted silver pieces, and jewels sent from various royal houses across Europe and the world. The Queen Mother, as already mentioned, gave the historic three-feather brooch. But from Saudi Arabia came another completely independent gift. The then Crown Prince Fahd sent Diana a complete sapphire and diamond suite designed by the Asprey Jewellery House, which included earrings, a bracelet, a watch, a ring, and the centerpiece of the entire set, a flexible necklace made entirely of baguette-cut diamonds, from which hung a large central sapphire. It is essential to understand this with total clarity. The Saudi diamond necklace and the Queen Mother's brooch were never the same jewel. They came from different people, from different countries, had been conceived in different sets and were intended to be worn separately, each with its own identity. Nobody in the palace designed them to work together. It was Diana, and only Diana, who had the idea to combine them. She took the central sapphire from the Saudi necklace and removed it completely. In the space left free, she suspended the historic three-feather brooch, as if hanging it from an invisible thread. Then, to complete the composition, she also added the detachable emerald right below the feathers. The final result appeared to the eyes of anyone seeing it for the first time as a single jewel designed coherently from the start. A continuous line of diamonds surrounding the neck, the feathers falling right in the center, and the emerald closing the composition like a final period. That is exactly what we see in the Vienna photographs. We are not looking at an intact necklace that has existed without changes since 1863, as was assumed for years. We are looking at a completely original creation by Diana, built with fragments from two different wedding gifts: the Queen Mother's brooch, Prince Fahd's diamond necklace, and the vision of a young woman who understood, long before most, that a single piece of jewelry can tell completely different stories depending solely on how it is combined. Diana had already shown that capacity for reinvention even before the night in Vienna. Photo archives place one of the earliest public appearances of the feathers in 1982, when she attended the Royal Opera House in a red dress signed by Belleville Sassoon. On that particular occasion, the centerpiece hung directly from the diamond necklace, but without the large emerald underneath. The absence of that single stone completely changed the visual balance of the entire composition. The jewel looked lighter, more youthful, almost like a draft still in progress. Diana had been carrying out her role as Princess of Wales for a very short time. William was just a baby. The public followed every detail of her wardrobe, every new hairstyle, every gesture before the cameras, with an intensity that today is hard to imagine without social media in the mix. Newspapers spoke of fashion and style, but in reality Diana was learning something much deeper: how to manage objects loaded with centuries of tradition without letting that tradition end up erasing her as a person. She did not always succeed immediately. At first, many of the jewels from the royal collection looked visually massive on her, almost as if they were not meant for her. Tiaras gave her real physical headaches after hours of protocol events. Rigid necklaces inherited from previous generations belonged to an aesthetic sensibility different from her own. But little by little, instead of using them exactly as they were supposed to be worn, Diana began adapting them to her own judgment. A perfect example of how far that creative freedom went is another gift from the Queen Mother, a large oval sapphire brooch surrounded by diamonds. In her first years as princess, Diana wore it pinned to her dress in the most traditional way possible, just as anyone would expect. But over time she transformed it completely, turning it into the centerpiece of a choker made of 7 strands of pearls. That choker would end up appearing in some of the most photographed and remembered moments of her entire public life. During her historic visit to the White House, on the night she danced with John Travolta before the world's cameras, in various gala dresses over the years, and in an especially significant way, in June 1994, atop the now legendary black dress that the press would end up dubbing the revenge dress. That particular night deserves to be told in some detail, because it reveals the same pattern of behavior that would later repeat itself with the feather jewel. Charles had appeared on national television publicly admitting he had been unfaithful to Diana, although asserting that the relationship was already, in his own words, irretrievably broken by that point. Diana had an invitation on her agenda to attend a charity gala at the Serpentine Gallery that very night. She could have cancelled. She could have stayed home, away from the cameras, processing in private what she had just heard on television in front of the whole country. She did not. She put on a black dress that had been stored in her closet for years because at the time it had seemed too daring to wear in public. She placed the sapphire choker on the bare skin of her neck and stepped out of the car in front of all the cameras awaiting her. The sapphire had been, originally, a gift from Charles's family. Diana turned it, that night, into a statement that spoke solely about herself. She did not destroy the history of that stone. She rewrote it completely, in front of the whole world, at the exact moment she felt the most pain. That same spirit of transformation repeated itself with other pieces from the Saudi suite. Elements of a sapphire watch ended up repurposed into a completely different pair of earrings. Other pieces of the original set could be dismantled and recombined depending on the occasion. During a tour of Australia, Diana even placed an emerald choker directly across her forehead as a headband, transforming a jewel designed for the neck into a completely new image that graced magazine covers around the world. Diana never treated royal jewels as inert objects intended solely for display. She moved them around, combined them in ways no one had anticipated, and forced them, in a sense, to accompany the woman she was becoming over the years. That is why, when someone claims today that modifying the shape of a historic jewel is automatically an act of disrespect toward Diana's memory, history forces us to pause for a moment. Diana also transformed jewels constantly. It was in fact a central part of her public identity. The real problem, then, was never the transformation itself. The problem, the one that really generated controversy years later, was something else entirely: Who wore the jewel after her? What specific part of Diana's original creation disappeared in the process, and what new story entered the room alongside the person wearing it? We move now to April 1986 to the city of Vienna, Austria. Diana is 24 years old and attends, alongside Charles, a gala performance at the Burgtheater to watch a staging of the play Love for Love. She is wearing a long sequin dress in a deep green shade, designed especially for her by Catherine Walker. The sleeves are long and fitted, the entire fabric seems to catch and reflect every flash of light, and around her neck is, finally, the complete composition we know today, the Saudi diamond necklace as the base, the 3-feather brooch occupying the exact center, and the emerald hanging right below, closing the entire visual line. The photographs from that night would become, over time, some of the most recognizable images of Diana's entire public career. She appears with a straight back, a serene expression, almost with a luminosity that seems to emanate from within. Charles is by her side, proper, formal. The 3 feathers she carries on her chest represent, literally, her husband's official title. The motto engraved on the jewel says, "I serve," and there is Diana, holding all that symbolic weight, resting directly on her own body. It is almost impossible to look at that photograph today without knowing what was happening outside the frame at that precise moment. In Charles's authorized biography, published many years later, he himself maintained that his relationship with Camilla had resumed only after the marriage was already, in his words, irretrievably deteriorated. Diana, for her part, told Andrew Morton a radically different experience, the constant feeling that there were 3 people occupying a space meant for 2, and that this feeling existed long before the general public knew any concrete details about the situation. We do not need to invent imaginary dialogues in the Vienna dressing room that night. We do not know, with documentary certainty, what Charles and Diana said to each other before stepping onto the theatre stage, nor what Diana was thinking exactly as she fastened the diamond clasp around her own neck. The only thing we do know, because it was recorded in photographs, is that she chose to wear it that night. She chose consciously to wear the official symbol of her husband's title during a diplomatic visit, right at the moment when her private life was beginning to crack ever more visibly behind closed doors. Diana would later explain that clothes, and by extension, jewelry, could function as a kind of personal armor. Not because fabric or diamonds could physically stop the pain she felt, but because they allowed her to decide with complete control which version of herself she wanted to show to the outside world on each specific occasion. When a marriage collapses in the intimacy of a home, most people have at least the possibility of closing a door and processing the pain in private. Diana did not have that luxury. She had to open an official car door, smile in front of hundreds of photographers, and walk directly toward a crowd of strangers watching her under a magnifying glass. That night in Vienna, her armor was deep green, and in the exact center of that armor she wore Charles's official emblem. Let us skip ahead 5 years in time, to October 1991, when the jewel reappears publicly, this time in Toronto, Canada. The complete royal family was conducting an official visit to the country at that time. William was 9 years old, Harry 7. The presence of the children in the official photographs managed, at least at first glance, to make many of those images appear to depict a perfectly united family. But the real distance between Charles and Diana was already almost impossible to disguise for those watching them closely. During the gala dinner held at the Royal York Hotel, Diana chose an intricately embroidered white dress, the Spencer tiara atop her head, and once again the complete combination of diamonds, feathers, and emerald around her neck. The tiara spoke, at that moment, of the family into which Diana had been born. The brooch spoke of the family she had married into by her own choice. The 2 stories, that of her birth name and that of her acquired surname, were thus superimposed on a single body, on the same night, under the same lights of a Canadian ballroom. It is worth remembering that the Spencer tiara had arrived with her at St. Paul's Cathedral 10 years earlier, in 1981, and that it never belonged to the official collection of the Crown. It was, and remains, the property of her paternal family, first her father and then her younger brother. The feather brooch, on the other hand, was always tied exclusively to the official position of Princess of Wales, not to the person wearing it at any given moment. Placing both pieces together, that night in Toronto, produced an image almost too perfect to be real. Diana Spencer and Diana, Princess of Wales, visually united for a few hours under one roof. But behind that apparent perfection, as we would learn later, very little real marriage remained. Barely 14 months after that dinner in Toronto, in December 1992, then Prime Minister John Major stood up in the House of Commons to officially announce that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. And after that Canadian visit, there are no widely documented records of public appearances of Diana using the combination of the feathers together with the diamond necklace. The visual symbol of her marriage literally disappeared from her neck even before the marriage ended in legal terms. In the years that followed the separation and, later, the formal divorce, Diana began to drastically simplify her public image. She significantly reduced the use of imposing tiaras and major institutional insignia. She continued wearing, instead, the pieces she felt were genuinely her own. The sapphire choker she herself had rebuilt with her own hands years prior, an aquamarine ring she commissioned specifically to mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life, simple pearl earrings, personal watches, objects that no longer needed to explain to the world which man she was legally bound to. The feather brooch, meanwhile, followed a completely different path that is considerably harder to trace with precision. Here is where press headlines often speak with a certainty that official documents do not actually fully support. Some sources claim that the jewel returned immediately to the Queen's hands. Others assert that it remained linked directly to Charles during all that time. Still others describe it simply as part of the general royal collection, without specifying a custodian. What is verifiable, what can truly be supported by evidence, is much more limited than all those versions. Diana stopped wearing it in public, nor was the piece handed over publicly to either William or Harry at any point afterward. And years later, it reappeared on Camilla. At the time, she already held the title of Duchess of Cornwall and official wife of the then Prince of Wales. To understand why not all jewels associated with Diana followed the exact same fate after her death, it is useful to imagine three separate boxes, though invisible to the naked eye. In the first box would be her truly personal items, private gifts she had received individually, purchases she herself had made with her own money, and pieces that legally formed part of her personal estate, transferable to her heirs without any institutional restriction. In the second box would be the royal loans proper, jewels that Diana was permitted to wear while officially representing the British crown, but which under no circumstances could she pass on as an inheritance to her own children, because legally they never belonged to her. And in the third box would be non-crown family pieces, like the Spencer tiara itself, which Diana used freely but which actually belonged to a completely different branch of her family tree, that of her father. Seen from the outside, under the lights of a gala event, all three categories of jewels sparkled exactly the same. Legally, however, they had absolutely nothing in common with one another. Diana, aware of this complexity, left behind a written letter of wishes attached to her will during her lifetime. In that document, she specifically requested that her personal jewelry, those from the first box, the ones that were genuinely hers, be allocated to the portion of her estate reserved for her sons, so that when the right time came, the future wives of William and Harry could wear them freely. It is a sentence loaded with an almost anticipatory tenderness. Diana had no way of knowing who those women would be. She could not foresee how the British monarchy would change in the following decades. She simply imagined that, one day, her sons would form their own families, and she wanted to leave them, through tangible objects, a concrete way to keep her present in their lives. That is why today we see Catherine wearing the sapphire engagement ring that originally belonged to Diana. That is why Meghan's engagement ring includes 2 diamonds that come directly from Diana's personal collection. That is why Meghan chose to wear Diana's aquamarine ring during her own wedding reception. And that is why, from time to time, certain pearls and certain earrings that belonged to Diana reappear in institutional events of great, but even within this relatively orderly story, there are versions that directly contradict each other. Paul Burrell, who was Diana's personal butler, claimed at the time that after the princess's death, William chose to keep his mother's Cartier tank watch, while Harry opted for the sapphire ring. Harry himself, however, later wrote in his memoirs that this specific version of events was simply not true, and that the ring was never actually in his possession to be able to gift it to his brother. We cannot honestly convert the memory of a single person into an unquestionable fact when one of Diana's own sons directly and publicly denies it. What we can observe, without needing to resolve that specific contradiction, is the visible final result. The ring appeared on Catherine's hand in the year 2010, whereas the 3-feather jewel never appeared publicly associated with either of Diana's 2 sons. For almost a full decade after Diana's death, the 3-feather brooch remained completely out of public view, stored in some location that official records do not detail. During that same period, Charles and Camilla moved with an almost calculated slowness toward the possibility of building a public and officially recognized life together. In January 1999, the couple walked out together from the Ritz Hotel in London after attending a private party. It was not, as some wanted to believe at the time, an accidental encounter with a handful of photographers who just happened to be passing by. Hundreds of professional cameras were already waiting, organized outside the exit. It was barely a few seconds of walking from the hotel door to the inside of a car, but those few seconds were enough to announce to the whole world that Camilla no longer had any intention of remaining hidden. Queen Elizabeth II, for her part, took considerably longer to publicly accept that transition. In 1998, she decided not to attend the celebration of Charles's 50th birthday, precisely because Camilla would be present at the event. In June of the year 2000, however, the situation began to change visibly. The Queen attended a celebration at Highgrove organised for the birthday of then former King Constantine of Greece, and Camilla was also present at that same gathering. William and Harry were direct witnesses to that first formal meeting between the two women. The British press interpreted it, almost unanimously, as the symbolic end of a silent boycott that had lasted for years. 5 years later, in 2005, Charles and Camilla finally married. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip opted not to attend the civil ceremony held at Windsor Town Hall, but they did attend without any hesitation the subsequent religious blessing held at St. George's Chapel. After the ceremony, it was the Queen herself who personally hosted the reception inside Windsor Castle. It was by no means a simple or immediate acceptance. It was rather an acceptance built deliberately in stages, almost as if every public gesture were carefully measured so as not to appear hasty. And just a few months after that wedding, something happened that very few saw coming at the time. The jewel that for years had been associated exclusively with Diana reappeared in public. In the autumn of 2006, Camilla attended the film premiere of The History Boys in London. She was wearing a dark jacket with green accents, and pinned directly onto the fabric was the 3-feather brooch, with the emerald hanging right underneath, exactly as it had been originally designed in 1863. The photographs from that night are perfectly crisp and were archived. This is, in reality, one of the earliest documented public appearances of Camilla wearing this specific piece, many years before the 2019 event that most media outlets usually cite incorrectly as her true debut with the jewel. And here we reach the part of this story that almost nobody anticipates when hearing it for the first time. Camilla did not appear that night showing off a brooch made by cutting the necklace Diana had worn in Vienna. What she showed was, simply, the original 1863 brooch, returned to the exact function for which it had been designed from the start, as a standalone piece, pinned directly onto fabric without the need for any additional necklace. The Saudi diamond necklace, the one Diana had used as the base for her composition, was not present at all that night. The specific creation that Diana had built, combining two completely different wedding gifts into a single visual piece, had been taken apart at some point, but the brooch itself was never cut to become a brooch, because, quite simply, it had already been one since its very inception, long before Diana was even born. There is no public document confirming that Camilla personally entered a vault, pointed at the necklace and ordered it to be altered. Nor is there any official palace statement identifying the jeweler responsible for any modification, nor a concrete date of transformation, nor a written instruction supporting that widely repeated version. The phrase Camilla cut Diana's necklace was repeated so many times, in so many different articles and videos, that it ended up sounding like a historically proven fact, but the photographs, analysed carefully and in chronological order, tell something considerably more precise. Diana hung a pre-existing brooch from a necklace she herself assembled by combining two different gifts. Camilla, years later, simply wore that same brooch without the necklace Diana had temporarily added to it. Correcting this technical detail, however, does not remove the emotional weight of the whole story. In a sense, understanding the complete truth makes it even deeper, because what disappeared over time was not a simple piece of precious metal. What disappeared was, specifically, the particular way in which Diana had decided to wear it, her personal composition, her creative gesture, her particular version of that shared family heritage. The physical object survived intact. Diana's artistic choice was, on the other hand, dismantled piece by piece. For some people, this is nothing more than the natural logic of any well-managed dynastic collection. The jewel, from its original design, specifically symbolizes the wife of the Prince of Wales, regardless of who holds that position at a given historical moment. Diana had officially ceased to occupy that position following her divorce. Camilla, time later, came to occupy it in her place, completely legitimately according to the internal rules of the institution. For other people, however, no purely institutional explanation manages to completely erase the deeply painful personal history that existed between these two specific women. Camilla was not, after all, just any Princess of Wales succeeding another neutrally. She was, specifically, the woman whose relationship with Charles had been at the very centre of the pain that Diana herself described publicly, in full detail, in interviews that shook the entire British monarchy at the time. Both interpretations, curiously, can be held at the same time without entirely contradicting each other. Legally, the piece was available to whoever held the corresponding title. Historically, it corresponded exactly to the institutional office, not to a specific person. Emotionally, however, it still felt as though something deeply tied to Diana had been deliberately placed onto the body of the woman with whom Charles had betrayed her. The intensity of the public reaction, when these comparisons finally circulated massively online years later, never depended solely on the diamonds themselves. It depended above all on collective memory. Skip ahead now to March 5, 2019. Buckingham Palace opened its doors that night to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Charles's official investiture as Prince of Wales, a ceremony that had originally taken place half a century earlier, in 1969. Elizabeth II herself personally hosted that night's reception. William and Catherine were present. Harry and Meghan also attended. Princess Anne was likewise among the guests. In one of the palace rooms, various original items from the 1969 investiture were displayed that evening: the ceremonial crown, the sword, the official ring, the symbolic rod, and the letters patent formally tied to the title. Camilla arrived at the reception wearing a green jacket and an understated pearl necklace around her neck. On her lapel, however, she wore the 3 diamond feathers along with the emerald hanging below. It was not, as we have already established, the first time she wore this specific piece in public, but it was, without a doubt, the most institutionally symbolic occasion on which she could have chosen to wear it. Absolutely everything at that particular reception revolved around Charles as Prince of Wales, the title he had received as a young man, decades of public service carried out under that same title, and the future already anticipated for him as the next king. And there, on the chest of his second wife, sat the exact same emblem that his first wife had worn around her neck decades earlier in both Vienna and Toronto. The exact same jewel, the exact same man. 2 completely different women, 2 radically different ways of wearing it. Queen Elizabeth was present that night, and that specific detail changes significantly the proper way to interpret everything that happened. It is tempting to wonder what the Queen might have thought in her heart of hearts, observing Camilla wearing a piece so associated with Diana, as if all of that had occurred behind her back or without her knowledge. But the entire reception was hosted directly by her. Official photographs show both of them inside the same event, sharing the same physical space, without any visible sign of tension. Any claim asserting that Elizabeth was completely unaware of the use of this jewel, or that she had forbidden it at some earlier point, would simply be an invention without any documentary support. What we indeed cannot know, because it belongs strictly to the private domain, is what the Queen felt inside while watching the scene unfold before her. The relationship between Queen Elizabeth and Camilla had traversed. To reach that point, years of initial resistance, careful negotiation, and gradual, measured acceptance. The Highgrove meeting in the year 2000 had opened the first formal door. The 2005 religious blessing had confirmed that the family, as an institution, would move forward together despite everything. And in February 2022, during the celebrations for the Platinum Jubilee of her own reign, Elizabeth recorded in writing her explicit wish that Camilla be known officially as Queen Consort once Charles ascended the throne. It was by no means a sentence spoken at random or by chance. It was a carefully considered institutional decision made by a woman who knew perfectly well that those specific words would define much of the monarchical transition after her own death. Because of all this particular story cannot be reduced, in a simplistic way, to a kind of secret, silent war between Elizabeth and Camilla over the fate of Diana's jewels. The complete reality turns out to be considerably more uncomfortable to digest than that simplified narrative. The same queen, who had been a direct witness to the deep suffering of her son's first wife, ended up over the years personally guaranteeing the title and institutional legitimacy of his second wife. And the feather jewel, meanwhile, travelled that exact same emotional path. First it belonged to Diana, then it passed to Camilla, and finally, as we will see now, ended up reaching Catherine. On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died. Charles automatically became king. William inherited, as tradition dictates, the title of Prince of Wales that had previously belonged to his father. And Catherine, his wife, officially became the new Princess of Wales, occupying the same title that generations earlier had been held by both Alexandra of Denmark and Diana herself. 75 days after that historic shift, on November 22, 2022, Catherine appeared at an official welcoming ceremony for the President of South Africa, dressed in a burgundy coat dress designed by Amelia Wickstead. On her chest, she wore for the first time publicly in her new role the 3-feather brooch with the emerald suspended right underneath. She combined it furthermore with a pair of diamond and pearl earrings that had originally belonged to Diana. That specific image closed, in an almost poetic manner, a full circle that had begun 159 years earlier, in 1863. The piece no longer remained on Camilla, simply because Camilla no longer held the title of wife of the Prince of Wales. She was now, formally, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The brooch, following the institutional logic that had accompanied it since its creation, passed automatically to the new woman officially associated with that specific title. Catherine, however, made an aesthetic decision different from that of her 2 immediate predecessors. She did not wear it as a necklace. She did not attempt to reconstruct the original combination Diana had assembled with the Saudi diamond necklace. She wore it exclusively as a brooch, exactly as both Alexandra had done in the 19th century and Camilla more recently. But Catherine's personal relationship with Diana's memory was evidently quite different from Camilla's. Catherine never got to meet her mother-in-law in person. Even so, she wears every single day, without exception, the engagement ring that originally belonged to Diana. William himself had explained at the time of publicly announcing his engagement to Catherine that choosing that specific ring was his personal way of ensuring that his mother, in some symbolic way, would not completely miss out on that important moment in his life. When Catherine decided to combine the historic feather brooch together with the earrings that had been Diana's, the joint gesture was interpreted almost unanimously as a heartfelt tribute, and not as an appropriation fraught with tension, as had indeed occurred at the time with Camilla's appearance. The physical object was exactly the same in both cases. The public reaction, however, turned out to be completely different. That notable difference demonstrates quite clearly that jewels never truly speak on their own. What speaks in reality is the personal history of whoever chooses to wear them on each specific occasion. In March 2023, Catherine wore the brooch again during the Commonwealth Day church service held at Westminster Abbey. On that particular occasion, she decided to remove the detachable emerald, leaving only the feathers and the diamond ring. In September 2025, she wore it again, once more without the emerald, during the official reception for the President of the United States at Windsor. And in December of that same year, she appeared with the piece again, this time during a state visit from Germany. Each of these successive appearances confirms, in a quite eloquent manner, the original structure with which the jewel was conceived in 1863. The emerald can be removed or added as convenient, and the entire brooch can adapt with complete freedom to each specific occasion. What Diana did decades ago, by temporarily turning it into the center of an improvised necklace, was by no means an act of sacrilege toward a sacred relic, as some later tried to frame it. It was, in reality, a brilliant and perfectly coherent continuation of the original function for which this modular jewel had been designed from the start. This makes a considerable portion of the headlines that circulated for years on this topic even more unfair. All too often, Diana is presented as the passive owner of a simple necklace that Camilla, later on, had the audacity to alter unilaterally. But documented reality demonstrates the exact opposite. Diana was never passive when it came to these jewels. Diana was, in fact, the true designer of the visual image that the whole world remembers to this day when thinking of this specific piece. It was she who paused to look at two completely independent wedding gifts, who decided to combine them with her own vision, who completely reinterpreted the original meaning of each element. She took two gifts delivered by two different men and converted them, with her own aesthetic criteria, into something that ended up seeming to belong solely to her, as if it had always been that way. Camilla, by contrast, invented absolutely nothing about the most famous and photographed form of this jewel. She simply undone it, returning it to a prior state that technically was the original one. And perhaps that is precisely what ends up being most bothersome to so many people, even without being able to articulate it clearly at first. It is not that the brooch remained within the same royal family, nor is it that another Princess of Wales, decades later, had full institutional right to wear it. What generates such a visceral reaction is that, seeing it pinned on Camilla's lapel, all the particular creativity with which Diana had transformed it into a completely original necklace vanished entirely before any viewer's eyes. The form Camilla chose was, without a doubt, historically the most correct and faithful to the original 1863 design. But the form Diana had invented was, quite simply, unforgettable for several generations of viewers. There is yet another crucial difference between both women that is worth pointing out clearly. Diana wore the feathers in 1986 and again in 1991, in both cases when her marriage to Charles still existed officially before the law and before public opinion, even if it was collapsing visibly behind closed doors. Camilla, on the other hand, wore them for the first time as Charles's lawful wife only after having survived a public scandal of enormous proportions, years of widespread social condemnation, and an extremely long wait until she could finally occupy her place in an openly recognized way. For one of the two women, these specific feathers could feel, in retrospect, like a matrimonial promise, slowly falling apart before the cameras. For the other, on the other hand, they represented the tangible confirmation that she had finally managed to reach the place that, for a long time, she had not been able to occupy openly. 03336. We do not know, honestly, if Camilla specifically thought of Diana at the exact moment she fastened the brooch onto her lapel. Nor do we know if she herself personally chose this particular piece for the movie premiere in 2006, or if some style advisor made that decision for her. We do not know if in 2019, before the investiture anniversary reception, she paused to look at the old photographs from Vienna before pinning the jewel to her jacket. Asserting any of these things with total certainty would be turning a simple personal interpretation into a proven fact, something this story, precisely, seeks to avoid at all costs. What we do know with certainty is that Camilla knew the complete history behind this jewel perfectly well. The entire royal family knew it without exception. The photographs from Vienna had circulated around the world for decades. The British crown jewels are catalogued, prepared in advance, and selected with extreme care before every official public appearance. Wearing those exact feathers on the specific investiture anniversary of Charles could hardly have been, then, a gesture completely empty of meaning or chosen at random. A jewelry expert can, without much difficulty, accurately measure the diamonds that make up this historic piece, approximately 4 carats spread among the 18 main stones and about 3 additional carats in the central cabochon emerald. They can also calculate, with relative accuracy, a market value close to £100,000 sterling, though any honest appraiser would immediately admit that a piece with this specific historical provenance could never be sold at a truly normal price in any conventional market. But no expert, no matter how qualified, can ever measure the real weight of the photograph that accompanies this jewel inseparably. The emerald weighs barely a few grams. The collective memory of Diana, on the other hand, weighs entire decades of accumulated history. For this specific reason, the public reaction was so intense every time these photo comparisons recirculated massively on social media. Some people spoke openly of a clear lack of sensitivity on the part of Camilla and the palace itself. Others defended, with equally valid arguments, that pieces belonging to the British crown never belong permanently to whoever wears them at any given moment, and that this very institutional continuity constitutes the reason for their existence over the centuries. Many people genuinely, and without ill intent, believed that Camilla had personally ordered an iconic necklace belonging to Diana to be cut. Very few, in contrast, paused long enough to notice that the brooch was already documented as an independent brooch in 19th century photographs, long before Diana was even born. The complete truth, in this case as in so many others, does not force anyone to feel any less intensely. It simply obliges one to feel with all the complete facts properly arranged on the table. Camilla did not steal, in any literal sense, any piece belonging to Diana's private personal jewelry box. There is no documentary proof that she herself ordered the destruction of a historic necklace, nor did she take, at any point, any jewel that legitimately belonged to William or Harry as a direct inheritance from their mother. What she indeed received, instead, was institutional access to a specific dynastic emblem associated since 1863 with the official position she herself came to occupy alongside Charles, with full legitimacy within the internal rules of the monarchy. But when she finally decided to wear it in public, she knew perfectly well, or at least should have known with complete clarity, that the whole world would not see only the Danish princess Alexandra of 1863 reflected in that image. They would inevitably see Diana standing in Vienna 30 years earlier. And that, given the specific historical circumstances, was practically unavoidable from any angle one looked at it. There are certain objects that legally belong, without any possible doubt, to a specific institution, but that emotionally end up belonging, forever, to a single image fixed in the collective memory. The tiara, popularly known as the lover's knot, belongs, in strict legal terms, to the British crown as an institution. Nevertheless, millions of people around the world continue to call it, spontaneously, simply Diana's tiara. The Lady Dior handbag is, in essence, a commercial product mass-produced by a French fashion house, but it bears that specific name precisely because the house itself decided to rename it after Diana popularized it worldwide through her constant use. The sapphire ring rests today, every day, on Catherine's hand, but it will always be recognized, first and foremost, as Diana's ring, no matter how many more generations inherit it afterward. The crown, as an institution, can perfectly well guard a physical jewel inside its vaults. What it can never fully control, no matter how hard it tries, is the collective memory that remains permanently attached to that specific piece in the public consciousness. The full story of this feather jewel reveals, furthermore, something that is often completely forgotten when speaking about Diana in general terms. Her true cultural power never resided in the legal possession of the objects she wore. Many of the most spectacular and remembered pieces she wore throughout her public life were never, in reality, legally hers. The tiara always returned to the custody of her paternal family. Institutional loans returned, sooner or later, to the official vaults of the crown. Dynastic emblems passed, according to the internal logic of the institution, to the next woman occupying the corresponding title. Even many of her most iconic and photographed dresses ended up being sold at a charity auction just months before her untimely death in 1997. And yet, every time any of those objects reappears in public, decades later, the entire world still instinctively looks for her. They look for her reflected in the sapphire. They look for her in the pearls. They look for her in the exact curve of a particular tiara. They look for her in an emerald suspended below 3 diamond feathers. And this happens not because Diana managed to legally retain any of these objects until her death, but because, through her particular way of wearing them, she gave them a story and a meaning they simply did not have before touching, if only briefly, her skin. That, at its core, is exactly what Camilla managed to take, even if she could never truly keep it or hold on to it permanently for herself. She took the physical brooch. She took the institutional symbol associated with the title. She took with full legal legitimacy the official place corresponding to the wife of the Prince of Wales within the structure of the monarchy. But the specific image of Diana, the one that remained fixed forever in the global collective memory, continued to belong exclusively to Diana, without any subsequent transformation of the jewel being able to alter that in any way. And then, finally, the jewel ended up passing to Catherine, the wife of Diana's eldest son. It did not reach her hands as a hidden object or one handed down in secret, but as a visible and public part of an institutional continuity that Diana herself, in a sense, had already imagined years earlier, though in a rather different way, in that letter of wishes she left written alongside her will, her personal jewels one day, on the bodies of the women who would deeply love her own sons. The specific feather brooch probably never formed part, in strictly legal terms, of that private inheritance Diana had in mind when writing that letter. But when Catherine decided to combine it, in 2022, together with the earrings that had indeed been genuinely Diana's, the final result came remarkably close to that original wish expressed in writing years before. A woman who today takes care of Diana's eldest son ended up wearing, on a single body and on the same public occasion, something belonging to the monarchical institution and something belonging directly to her deceased mother-in-law. Just as had happened before in Toronto, decades prior, family and crown, two completely different stories, superimposed on a single body, in a single photograph. Now that you know the complete chain of events, with all the nuances and details properly ordered, we want to know what you think about it. Do you believe Camilla had full institutional right to wear this specific brooch, simply by officially occupying the position of wife of the Prince of Wales, regardless of the personal history behind it? Or do you believe, on the contrary, that out of respect for Diana's memory, and considering all the particular history between these two women, there were certain specific jewels she should never have put on, no matter how legitimate her title was? And there is yet a third possibility, perhaps the most interesting of all. Do you believe the real problem was never wearing the jewel itself, but choosing precisely the events dedicated directly to Charles, one after another, to do so in such a visible way? Leave us your honest opinion in the comments. We truly want to read them all. Let us return, to close this story, to those two photographs with which we began this video. Placed side by side, they no longer tell, after everything we have reviewed together, such a simple story as it seemed at first. In Vienna, Diana wears around her neck, a creation entirely her own, diamonds from Saudi Arabia, a historic brooch, originally gifted by the Queen Mother, and an emerald falling, suspended, over a dress of a deep and unforgettable green. In London, years later, Camilla wears only the brooch, returned to its oldest and original form, pinned near her heart on a simple jacket. Nothing was literally cut, contrary to what so many sensationalist headlines maintained for years without any verification. But there was, without a doubt, something that was indeed separated in the process. Diana's personal and original design was dismantled piece by piece. Her particular way of telling this story through a combination of jewels physically disappeared from the piece, and in its place remained, exposed in full view, the bare emblem of the institutional title that, for years, had linked these two women through the same man. Diana once said in one of her most remembered interviews that what she truly wanted was to be a queen of people's hearts. She did not need to achieve it any formal coronation, nor did she need any official document to define her institutional rank forever, and, as we have seen throughout this entire journey, she did not even need to legally retain every diamond she ever wore on her body. Almost 30 years after her untimely death, Camilla can wear with full legitimacy the jewels belonging to the crown. Catherine can inherit, in a perfectly legal manner, the institutional symbols associated with the title of Princess of Wales. Royal vaults can open and close as many times as necessary over the decades. Precious stones can continue changing necks, lapels, and generations indefinitely. But every time that specific emerald reappears in public, hanging beneath the same three feathers as always, the entire world, almost automatically, continues to remember Diana first, and that, no matter how many more transformations this jewel undergoes in the future, is something that simply cannot be dismantled. Thank you for joining us to the end of this video and for continuing to remember her together with us every time we share a story like this. If you would like to keep accompanying us in future installments, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There is still much more of her story to tell, and we will continue doing so with the same care and respect for the facts. And if you want to discover what happened to another of the jewels that Diana transformed completely to turn it into a silent message directed to the whole world, click right now on the video appearing on your screen to learn that full story.